Hi everyone, my name is Janul Silva. I was part of the Sri Lankan national team in 2020. I was also a captain of the Royal College debate team, and I've been a coach for the Sri Lanka development squad and an assistant coach for the Sri Lankan national team. What I'll be doing in this video is doing a brief rundown of Motion 1 of Chapman, which is that this House would ban political parties and require all candidates for national public office to seek elections as independents. So the way I'm going to structure this is firstly, we'll go into some ideas on what setup will look like for proposition and some basic arguments they can run. And then on opposition, we'll look at the arguments that they're likely to run and what their setup would look like. And then we'll look at what the clashes will probably boil down to at the end of this debate. So going in then on proposition, I think you'd want to set up two things at the top of your speech. Firstly, why there is this necessity to ban political parties. And there could be a couple of things you talk about here. One could be that people are so tribal about voting for political parties that this results in them making bad decisions that don't align with their interests, so that political parties blinker how people think about who to vote for, and making them run as independents will make people make better decisions. The second thing could be that the existence of political parties leads to political gridlock, that the way political parties structured are such that they exist in opposition to each other, and the way elections happen now mean that when people do get elected in parliament, there's incentives for them to act against each other rather than act together to advance government. So here, like picking the characterization you want, that either people aren't voting in their best interest, this leads to political gridlock, could be a nice way to frame the problem that you want to address. Because what you're doing is quite drastic. You're banning all political parties and making people run as independents. So a good problem setup is critical for proposition. The second thing that's important to do, and that some propositions might not, because you might not think it's important, is do some characterization as to what banning political parties looks like. Because even though it's intuitive that you'd ban them, there's a couple of helpful things that might be good to model. Like one, what does it look like for people to run as independents? A helpful piece of modeling that proposition could do is add in that you might have resource limitations on how much you can spend on a campaign as an independent to ensure that richer candidates can't just buy up TV time or buy up being seen, and that could be something you want to set up. The second thing could be that there is allocations of TV time for each candidate to ensure that you have an accurate representation of every candidate within the field. And these are helpful things that you could think about in terms of what you do in addition to banning political parties, so stopping them from existing. But what do you do to ensure that the system is better for independence than it might be presently? That being said, there's maybe two broad arguments you could run in proposition that you'd want to be having some variation of within your first speech. The first thing I think you could run is to say that this makes people make better political choices. And while some teams might make this argument, it's important to firstly prove why democracy is so important and why people having a choice is so important. And there's a few ways you could go about this. You could argue that you sacrifice so much resources to be under the state, that you give so much money as tax, that you are subject to laws and the possibility of the state using violence against you, and that this affects everyone you know. It affects you, it affects your family, it affects your children. So being able to participate in democracy is central to this like contract you have with the state. And if then you are making a bad choice, a choice that doesn't cater to your interests, all these sacrifices you make are in vain. And that's why like democracy is important as a principle. And proving why that principle is so important is better than just saying, oh, like democracy isn't being upheld and not having something to back it up. Why then do you make better political choices? The first thing you could say is that in its present form, the existence of political parties provides a simplification of politics that makes people make decisions that are against their interests because you don't look any further. Why is that the case? One, your parents and friends could be voting in a certain way, and it's easy for you to continue to vote along those lines rather than look at specific candidates. And because you've been doing it for the past so long and you've been voting for a particular party, you continue to do that. And it's harder to do that with um, independent candidates because independent candidates will change over time, even though the party that your family and friends are voting for has remained constant. The independent candidates will change, which means you're constantly forced to reevaluate the choices you make. The second thing is that there are certain historic factors that can link you to a political party in a way that ensures that the same political party remains in power for decades. So, for example, if you have a party like the African National Congress or a party that fought like very strongly for independence, like say within Sri Lanka, that you have those parties being able to run on those mandates and people continue to vote from them, even though the politicians within those parties change and their linkage to that previous success, like beating or like overcoming apartheid or being able to achieve independence or being able to achieve some kind of radical economic reform, even though the politicians that were responsible for that or the circumstances that that thing happened and have changed, you still vote for them. And that means that you aren't necessarily voting on something rational, you're voting on like this belief that is tied to a political party that is different because the people have changed. The third thing is that there is a simplification because you believe you know what a party does. You generally know what the Republican Party stands for, which means you often don't really think about what the candidate like has done. So you ignore a lot of things. Like one, you ignore the candidate's track record, you ignore things the candidate might have done that might be in opposition to the party's ideals, and you ignore your own interests and actively like comparing what the Democrat candidate says and what the Republican candidate says because you have this belief that, oh, the Democrat Party will always cater to my beliefs because I'm a minority, and that might not necessarily be true. So what this means is that your interests aren't being catered to because you aren't viewing every single candidate as an option, which means there's necessarily less information you have to make any decision, and that's something that's bad. And for all the reasons that democracy is important, this is a failure within that system, which is why you need to do away with political parties. The second half of this argument could also be to analyze the incentives of politics to be polarized. That one, there's incentives for politicians to like criticize the other side and make them seem incredibly horrible. There's incentives of media to paint political parties as being so diametrically opposed to each other that often people just won't look at what the other candidates are saying or look at extremely biased media. And the upshot of this is that even when the party you support is not making sense for you, so like you're a voter and they're not catering to your interests and the other side is catering to it better, you just don't want to look at them or you don't see their content just because the way media exists makes you not think of that as an option at all. In the absence of this, when there's independent candidates, you're likely to be exposed to at least some information about candidates who might have differing political beliefs to you because you don't have this preconceived bias based on what political party they're part of. So you listen to the policies and you actively think more about what's better for you. So all of this means you make a better, more informed choice as a voter. The second strand of argumentation you could talk about is why you get better policymaking. And here you could argue about the structure of political parties. That they often have things like manifestos that you want to vote alongside or in line with your party, and that's what makes your base want to continue voting for you. So the moment you vote against a policy that is perceived to be Democrat and you are part of the Democratic Party, you are criticized, one, by party leadership that now doesn't want to nominate you for the seats and things like that. But also your voter base now thinks, oh, this person is a snake. And they're like shifting gears from like what I voted them in for because I voted them in to be a Democrat and to not have like much say beyond that. In this sense, you get a lot of partisanship within the political process. And what this means is that you get political gridlock because you have often two major political parties that vote against each other. And the reason they do this is because you want to continue to hold on to your base. In the instance where you have independence, one, when you go into power and you make a parliament or you're trying to pass a policy, you no longer have these pre-drawn lines that exist before you get into power, which means you're more likely to collaborate. But two, you evaluate policies on a face value for what they are, as opposed to who is passing it and whether you want to seem like your party is more powerful. So you get coalitions built up on the fly, you get people trying to cooperate and like push things through. And also, given that you no longer come in as a Tory or a Labour Party member within Parliament, you get more mixing of ideas because you have all these independent candidates with different ideas. There's more nuance because you're no longer like boxed in by this political ideology of a party. And all of this means that you get better policy making. So here you can see two major thrusts coming from proposition side. One, that you get this better democracy, and this clash will boil down to which side can prove which side voters are able to make better, more informed decisions and how that applies to a democratic principle. But the second thing is which side gets better policy, and there's multiple ways you can weigh both of these. Like, is there this moral right to control the policies that govern your life, or do the policies themselves that actively govern your life have concrete impacts? And then you could weigh those things based on scale, you could weigh those things based on certainty, and there's a lot of things you could do within this debate. Let's pivot towards op for a second here and look at the arguments they can run. One angle they could do to attack this democracy clash and bring their own push is to say that the existence of political parties allows people to make better decisions than a world in which you're forced to evaluate so many candidates and not have too much information on any of them. And here you could just do a lot of characterization and setup as to how many independent candidates you're likely to get. And that political parties do a great job of ensuring that like viable candidates are put in front of you, that it streamlines the process, and it allows you to have a brief understanding of what they do, which then allows you to listen to the specifics of their campaign rather than like do the groundwork of figuring out exactly what they're doing on every single issue. And what does this mean? First thing is that these policies, that these political parties will often have things like manifestos and stances on key issues, whether this is issues on things like immigration, things like labor laws, things like how much free trade you should have, how we should treat businesses. And given that you have these ideas, all politicians need to do is explain the ways they might deviate from the central party policy. And in this case, it's easy for people to make decisions. One, because you know what the party's been doing. So you know what these politicians are likely to be able to do and what their central party leadership will allow them to do and what their base will allow them to do. Which means that you no longer have to spend time listening to each candidate, that you don't have to like make complicated decisions every single time an election comes about. And you could maybe say that there's so many different types of elections. You have state elections, you have local government elections, and that's just like so much information that people have to deal with. And then you could say that this is a privilege that a lot of people might not have. Just because one, you might not have the resources to listen to all these political parties. Two, you could maybe push back against the idea that there can be funding caps and say it might be only a few political parties that you actually hear. And then in the absence of all of these things where you don't have time to listen to political parties and you don't have like too good an understanding of what each person is saying, then you might end up voting along lines of, does this person look like me? Does this person speak like me? Does this person come from the same background as me? As opposed to accurately weighing up your policy, you could then argue that you default to other metrics that are significantly more random and significantly more likely to hurt your interest than the party line, because the party line is often something that's easy for you to understand, easy for you to engage with in the political process. You can also do framing about how political apathy is on the rise, that people just feel like politics is too complicated, they have too little impact on this. And now when there's so many independent candidates and like say big businesses continue to wield a lot of power, their ability to like feel engaged and want to listen to each of them and make these holistic decisions is incredibly low. That it's much easier for them to be engaged when there's clear political parties that they can understand a bit better, and now politics isn't like this rich people's thing where you need to spend so much information, so much time, and be like this incredibly smart political theorist to participate in. The second push opposition can make is on this idea of better policy making. That one, when political parties exist, you already have like these coalitions that are made, so it's easier to pass policy when you do get into power. That even though majority and opposition or like the ruling party and the opposition party exist, there's incentives to make coalitions with minority parties. There's incentives to collaborate with the majority party because at the end of the day, both of you want to help the country. And in this case, having these lines drawn means that when you want to pass something, it takes less time to get people to support you. It's easier to like do things like check. There's less power struggle within parliament because you already know you have some allies and you just need to make a few more, as opposed to like multiple people catering to multiple different interests, which means that like discussions take longer. You're not sure who has your back. And all of this means that it's easier to actively get things done. But the second thing is that the fact that an opposition party exists, you could really argue that the existence of an opposition party and this being a centralized party is great because this acts as a check against the ruling party. And even in the instance of independent people, you'll still have to have a parliament or some kind of ruling group that is built up within parliament. And in the absence of a opposition party, it'll be other independents criticizing this group of independents that join together to pass policy. The moment it's fragmented like this, it's much harder for the opposition to act as a credible pushback against the majority. And then you could go into a bunch of reasons why having this fragmented resistance to whatever party is in power or whatever group is in power is such a bad thing, that this means that the policies passed are weaker, that they might hurt some interests. And again, you can really weigh out why having these structures, while they might have some harmful effects, mean that this like tempers the worst possible effects of democracy of making bad decisions. And here the way you can weigh this is just in terms of the scale of people, the intensity of the harm that certain people can go through. And then again, you really want to like prove that you get better democracy when people understand what's going on, and prove that the breaking down of political parties, especially in this day and age, is what makes people fully disengage from politics. Um, at the end of the day, a lot of this is quite brief and there's a lot of depth you can go into each of these clashes. But I think this is a good starting point, especially in the first speeches, to see where the debate is likely to go and figure it out from there. But yeah, thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, link them in the comments and we can probably get back to you. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.